The Americans already know they're going to get in the war, and they're prepared for this and been preparing for it since 1935 at air training schools like Maxwell Field, where this group of Air Force thinkers that's going to envision and come up with a new form of warfare. High-altitude strategic bombing by daylight. The idea is we can fly so high that we'll be able to bomb accurately from as high as 3 and 4 miles in the sky. Maybe we'll fly above the German anti-aircraft fire. And the plane, the B-17 Flying Fortress, was considered at the time so fast, it's as fast as any fighter in the world, and maybe we can outrun the fighters, so you don't need fighter escorts. So this is the theory, that the bomber will always get through to the target and can hit the target accurately. It was all wrong. Air Forces are numbered. It was called the Army Air Forces. It's a wing of the Army and didn't become independent until after World War II. And the 8th Air Force is formed in the month after Pearl Harbor. And the 8th Air Force is comprised of 7 men and no planes. So they have to build this entire Air Force. It's going to be the largest striking force in the history of the world. They have to build it on foreign soil. It'd be like building something like General Motors on foreign soil with 334,000 employees. England is a giant aircraft carrier, that island from which we're going to bomb Nazi Germany. And the bombing begins in August 1942. And the thing about it is, it's the first American strike against Hitler. None of our ground troops are engaged in action as yet. And the air war that's fought is the longest military campaign of World War II. It's also the first campaign to take the war directly to Hitler's doorstep. The 306 bomb group, this was the 3rd bomb group to enter the European war. So they are, one of the originals. And it's tremendously undermanned Air Force at the time. And the missions they're flying are inordinately difficult.
Every theater commander is screaming for crews and equipment. 50,000 airplanes. That's what they say they're building. I wish we had 500.
One of the things that Hitler did with his conquest of France was he was able to move his submarine pens from up on the North Sea out onto the Bay of Biscay, so they're much closer to their hunting grounds in the Central Pacific. And if they can knock out the convoys that are carrying goods from the United States to England, they might be able to knock England out of the war.
There's only one hope of shortening this war: daylight precision bombing. We fold, daylight bombing is done with.
That's one of the things that's kind of understated in the film, but is the real reason these guys are flying these inordinately difficult missions, because the pens were very well protected. And then if you bombed absolutely correctly, your bombs bounced off the concrete like ping pong balls. And the commanders knew this, but the pressure is coming in from Churchill and Roosevelt. These pens have to be knocked out.
We haven't been penetrating the concrete in those sub-pens, Keith. We can't get concentration and accuracy from 19,000. We've got to go in once down low to see if we can get the job done in one trip, instead of fighting our way to the target 5 times and back for nothing.
Ira Aker, the commander of the 8th Air Force Bomber Command, orders the 306 to fly a low-level mission. Well, they'll fly under the clouds. Now, don't forget, these guys are all trained to bomb at 26 and 27,000 feet. They're not trained to go in low. And the feeling was if they go in low, they can go in underneath the curtains of flak and perhaps even underneath the radar. Regensburg-Schweinfurt mission, it's the largest raid up to this point by the 8th Air Force. At this point in the war, they're flying without fighter coverage. The fighters can cover them across the channel on what they call shallow penetration missions. But once they get to German airspace, they're on their own. So they go down this chute, and they're hit all the way down to Schweinfurt and Regensburg. And they are the guinea pigs that test it, and they're slaughtered doing it. They lose on this raid 60 planes. That's 600 guys.
One thing to remember about these young men who are flying these planes is that they are young men.
Bomber boys, That was the phrase that was used at the time.
They were regular guys, and they did a hell of a job.
They're in their late teens, they're in their 20s. If anybody's 24, they call them Doc or the old guy. So they are coming out of training in the United States, and they're having to face an enemy in this new style of bombing, this daylight bombing. which makes them obviously a lot more vulnerable. So they have to grow up fast to take those planes out there and to bring them back.
I'm in an airplane today, flying from here to LA, and the plane jumps, and my stomach jumps. Imagine flying through a flak field.
The plane would be knocked out of formation and vulnerable to attack. Major Wilson pulled out and flew with it to support it. That was courageous.
Savage to crew, how bad are we hit?
Right waist to commander. We're hit bad, sir. In radio compartment. On fire.
One of the important things to note about the B-17 Flying Fortress, the fuselage is very, very thin. As a result, enemy aircraft, fighters that were in the area, enemy flak that was sent up from the ground could do a lot of damage to this particular aircraft. But one of the things that the crews loved about the aircraft was the fact that it could get a whole lot of holes in it and you could still get home.
In World War II, the Marines lost 20,000 men in the entire Pacific War, from Pearl Harbor to Nagasaki. The 8th Air Force lost 26,000 men, 6,000 more than the entire Marine Corps. A guy's chances of surviving a mission in the early years were about 1 in 3. August 17th is the first mission, 1942. As of that early April, no one had completed 25 missions, which is the required number of missions that would allow you to get relief from combat duty. No one had made it up to that point. Harrison Salisbury, the Times reporter, said to fly with the 8th Air Force is to hold a ticket to a funeral, your own.
The scariest part of a mission, to me, was the dark before dawn. The crew chiefs are revving up all the bombers on the base, creating the roar of death.
See, this is intermittent war. These guys aren't fighting every day. But sometimes that can create phobias in the minds of people. You know, you go up there, you see a plane explode, and your second baseman, your third baseman, your right fielder, and your softball team are in that plane, your buddies in your barracks. You go down, you think about that. Am I next? You don't fly the next day. You're socked in, it's rain, it's cloudy. You fly 3 days later, you see 2 more planes blow up. You fly 3 days after that. It just eats on you. When is my turn?
Fellow waist gunner just got hit in the head with a 20 millimeter, and his jawbone, so much of it jammed my machine gun.
When a guy broke down in combat on the ground, it was usually because of the accumulated horrors that they experienced day after day after day after day, the grind of the thing. Air guys broke down in a different way. They suffered phobias. Guy might be flying one day and the tail of a plane blows off. He went down with the tail. No parachute, crash landed and lived. They sent him up 4 days later on another mission. He's terror-stricken. He has a phobia of flying now. Every time the wind whipped through the plane. And see, at this height, the wind is whipping through the airplane because the gun portals on the waist are open. It's 60 degrees below inside the plane. Guys are getting frostbite, and if they're hit, there's no medics around. One of your buddies pulls out a vial of morphine, sticks it in you, puts you on the freezing floor of the plane, covers you up, and you hope you make it back 6 hours later when the plane returns to England. The phobia overcomes you. It's not constant, it's not the grind. It's a very, very different kind of warfare. One's incessant on the ground, constant fighting, marching in the mud. One's intermittent.
Once we were hit and dropped away, there was no saving us, you know. 12 fighters descended on us. So I thought, well, this is a waiting game now, and I may as well just go back to my gun and play it out until the good Lord tells me, give it up. The pilot gave the order to get out. And when I went out, and we were pretty high, you know. It was pretty difficult to breathe. We were high, you know, because of the oxygen. And, but it was so peaceful. Not a sound. And, but what bothered me most in this situation was how I was going to get back to London by 1 o'clock for a date with a Red Cross girl. You know?
I went to the bomber bases as the character does in the opening. And I walked across those weed-choked fields. The runways are still partially preserved. The old towers are still there, you know, with the weeds whipping in the wind around them. Some of the Nissan huts are still there, the corrugated iron huts that the guys lived in. And what's great is the English people, they don't really figure that much in this film, but the English people who live around these old bases, many of them have restored the base, turned the control tower into a museum. And today, the 8th Air Force is probably better known in England than it is in the United States.
Whether or not strategic bombing actually helped win the war, that depends on who you ask.
The Army view is that wars are won on the ground. The Air Force view is wars can be won in the air. So it's an ongoing, an ongoing discussion, ongoing argument.
The Army's own strategic bombing survey that they completed after the war concluded that strategic bombing was helpful but didn't exactly win the war.
Since the 1920s, it's been a big fight in terms of military theory and also between the services, just about the effectiveness of bombing. Does it really make a difference? There's still people still argue about World War II in this way. I read a book recently that said, you know, in fact, bombing did nothing. It didn't help in terms of the cost-benefit ratio. Number of people killed, the amount of money spent.
I think the 8th Air Force did a lot in World War II, but I think like any war, it's like Neptune's trident, the three things. You need Navy, you need Air Force, you need infantry. And I think the war could not have been won without the 8th Air Force.
It was the forefront of saving Western civilization. That's what First Over Germany was. I'm glad I was there.